Cool. So, yes.
Beginning, what are the brackets at the end of link for again?
Oh, these brackets. This is just to add spacing between the links. Yeah, so that the links don't look visually just next to each other. You can try without, and you will see what I mean. Cool. What's gonna happen once I go to the browser right now? No. Anybody seeing an error in the browser? I should be getting an error in the browser. This error. How many of you have seen this error before? Okay, a few of you. Peter. That's correct. So provided does that for the Redux store, but for React Router DOM, we need the browser router, right? So this is, I like to do this in index.js. So let's go to index.js. Remember, Command P to typing in the name of any files, very handy, not having to search in in here. When you have a big app, it's kind of tedious to find a file here. If you remember the name, just do Command P and type in the name, like producer. And it lets you, you don't even need to, at least one part of the name you remember, like store, type it, hit enter, that opens the file automatically. Cool, so we said we need the browser router here. So let's do something like this. Import browser router from React Router DOM. Now, here, then, we need to wrap our entire app into the browser router. As I said, doesn't matter if you wrap the browser router first, like this, or if you put the browser router inside, like this. So it doesn't matter which one is wrapping which one. I don't have a preference. I think I'm gonna leave it this way. Browser router. Counter and films. Let's see. There should be a space here. Doesn't. Oh. Because this space matters. I just removed the space around here. Now we have that space here. Cool. If we go to counter, we should see our counter. We can modify the counter. If we go to films, that doesn't take us anywhere because we don't have that component yet. But something that we can already notice here is because we're keeping this counter in the store, I go to, I increase it, and I go to films, the counter disappeared. The counter, it was erased, but the store is not. The store is persistent. And when I go to counter, the counter mounts again, is created again, and because it's reading the state from the store, then it still receives the all counter as I left. Yes?
It still gets destroyed.
Still gets destroyed.
Saves
Right, the store is keeping our information, and we can think of the store as keeping the information sort of globally outside of our app or our individual components. That's why then these lines are sort of the representation of connector or of a component being connected. The line coming down, you could think of the state coming from the store onto the component. The line coming up is when a component dispatches an action to the store. And actually, we could think of also these two lines as these two parts. Map state to props, map dispatch to props. Map state to props is the one that's bringing the state from the store into the component. Now dispatch to props is the one that's allowing the component to dispatch actions to the store. Questions so far? We set up some links. Let's actually also set up the other route. Let's do path/film. And component, let's do films. We haven't written that component yet. Let's do that next. We should probably have like a home page. So I'm gonna do route path just a slash. I'm gonna do a component equal home. We haven't written that component yet. Let me put this here to the side. I'm going to create the home component. Let's go on components and let's click on new home.jsx. Let's import React and let's do const home equal this minimalistic just for displaying purposes component. Export default equal home. Let's do return. Live with h1. Welcome to counter and films. P, where you can count and leave a film review. Let's then import that in our app. Import home from components home. Cool. Yes. Right. Yes, thank you. That equal is not necessary. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yes, this is not necessary either. So that should have given us a home component. Let's comment out the not the counter film so that we don't have yet. Oh, we'll probably need a link to go to home. So let's add that link here to slash home. And I commented out the films route just so it doesn't break and we can try the routes that we currently have. So go here. We are in home. We go to counter. Oh, we still see home. We go to films. We still see home. The URL is changing, but the component is not. I'm in. Exact path where? In the switch, we could do, again, remember we could do exact path here, or put this route as the end. So exact path for our home component. Now we're able to switch between home, counter, Films, we haven't implemented that yet. Cool, let's do the films. So I'm just gonna copy home, paste it, change the name to films. Let's call this films now. Let's change the H1 to do films. Let's change this P to should show a list of films. This is just a placeholder for now. Films. Let's uncomment the route. Then import films. And we have home counter films. We're able to switch between the multiple routes. Questions so far? Common thoughts? Yeah.
That's so somewhere that you can, we have an import home films and counter. That's sort of an easy way to just kind of combining all those into one line and then adding it to a file somewhere and kind of importing it. Is that like something that's doable with what we're doing now?
That's definitely doable. Some people have an index.js in components. Then they import everything in there, and then they import like films, counter, home, and then when they're importing home, they're just saying, or let's say they want to import home and films, they just say import home and film from components/index. Yeah. Other questions? Yes. Sure. Let's take a 5-minute break. Grab some water before we get into the Redux stuff.
Didn't drink enough today. Thank you.
Which one? If you put the red at the end, then you don't need the examples. You can include it, but you don't.
I just moved it down there. I brought that.
Yeah, but it was the link. The link was pointing along. I'm talking about React
That's right.
doesn't have a browser.
Oh, I'm talking about that.
Oh,
I literally don't know.
I'm
I
not
don't know,
sure.
I don't know. But. Let me get back.
But it was-
I don't know. What else I got? Security. I was wearing a cap. We're talking about it.
Oh my God, I wouldn't even start.
Don't you guys have like regions?
We finished that last week. We're doing midterm now. I like. Actually, that's for that. I don't remember. I think we did it for the summertime. I don't know how they do it. All I know is that mine's called. What's it called? No, it's like, you know, like, if you ask a question about how you feel.
I'm not going to be back.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very, I don't know.
So they got
Okay, so any questions before we move on to actually have films connected to the store and making a network request? Okay, so I'm glad that routes seem a little bit more settled now, like routes and links. We're gonna need another route here. Where once we see the need for it, we're gonna add it, which is this route that I showed here. We have slash films that's gonna render the films component. We're gonna have slash film slash ID to get to that film page, that specific film page by the ID, and it's gonna be exactly the same as you did in the React assessment. Now let's think about the films component. I'm gonna close app. I don't think we have to go back to it in a while. I'm gonna close home, and I'm gonna do films. So I said we're gonna use two APIs. One is this one, the Studio Ghibli API. You used this in the past. I think that was Unit 2, maybe. And we're gonna use this one, Film Review API. Let me share this too with you in the Slack channel. Let's chat. Or maybe, you know what, I'll put it in online resources. Oh, by the way, I want to plug in, Amin shared this Redux for Beginners video. It's great quality, shows a little bit a different approach. The more point of views you can get, the better to understand Redux. Still the same pieces, maybe the way that they're introduced a little bit different, but highly recommended. So we're going to use that and this. So this API, like since you now have built backends, you are probably able to write your own later on. This API that I built is very simple. It lets you add a review, get all reviews, get review by a review ID. Do we have? Oh, right. This is the only thing that we're gonna need. This all stuff I never got to finish, but we're gonna need this tool, which is get all the reviews, or add a new review, and get all the reviews giving a film ID and an app ID. So this is right. So there are two endpoints. So for this app, for this API, we're gonna need to like register our app first. Similar to the way in which you need to get an API key. I decided to do this where you sort of register an app before you can actually store reviews. Because if you build something that maybe is going to use this API, I want to be able to notify you if I'm no longer going to maintain it or if I'm going to remove it for some reason. So the registration is a one-time step where you just put your name and your email, and that's it. And that's just because I wanted to say, I don't know, I feel like I saw some of you building like apps for the To-Dos API, for instance, and if for whatever reason I remove my Heroku account or I get hacked, then your app is going to break. And I want to, this will, in case something like that happens, I could let you know, send you an email, say, hey, this API is going away. Or anything like that. But you can imagine like this API has a reviews table and a users table. That's where the reviews are saved. The reviews have like a film ID. Actually has an app ID, a film ID, and a reviewer username and a text where we keep that. So for this, we're just gonna use. Oh, also let me share this link. You don't have to download it and run it yourself. Reviews. Wait, I deploy this to FSW. Yes, I forgot. This is the link that we're gonna use for sending reviews. You can see that like actually the Ghibli API is also running on Heroku, same as mine. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna use the Ghibli API to get the films, and we're gonna use the film reviews API to store the reviews for those films. The Ghibli API was let us get stuff, let us get films, but it doesn't let us add anything like comments or anything like that. That's why I built this other one to sort of complement it. And basically, for the films, we're gonna show a list of films. Those are gonna come from the Ghibli API. We're gonna have a film page where you're gonna have a review form. That review form will send that information to your to the review films API, which is the one that I built. Okay, so let's get into it. So we have our films. Let's say then we want to get all the films from the Ghibli API. What do we need to do? Make a function. What would that function do? Get all films, okay. From where? What endpoint? Heroku, so that's correct. So if we go to the documentation for the Ghibli API, Studio Ghibli, and we see the endpoint. So this is the base URL, so I'm going to copy that. I know that I'm going to need that. let's maybe paste it in here, like const API URL, call that, just keeping track of it. See what else. Slash authentication, there is no authentication necessary. Use case, other libraries, films, returns all films. So this one seems to be the one we need. Let's see an example. Oh, just slash films. So the full URL will be this: http ghibli heroku app slash films, as Jonathan mentioned. Let's paste that here. Cool. So we have a URL. I like the idea of creating a function. So let's create a function. Let's call it get all films. Put the URL there. So we want this get all films, fetch all films. So I like fetch better. What do we do from here? Lewis.
Do we have to make this asynchronous?
We're gonna need to make this asynchronous. Why?
Because it returns a promise.
Yes. What is gonna return a promise?
The Axios request?
Axios request. So we need to make a network request to the API to get all the films. Let's maybe do this. Make network request, Axios call, API call, all those meaning the same thing. So then that means we're going to need to use Axios here. Wait, import from Axios, right? How do we make an Axios call? Hugo? Const res equal await Axios that get API URL. What's this missing? Peter. O'Neill. Try catch. I feel like we, for now, we are just console logging the errors. In a React application, you should display a notification to the user, some message, so that the user doesn't just be left without any feedback about what went wrong. That's something that I feel like we haven't had the time to do. You could think, for instance, with the Toastify, the React Toastify, you could say notify error, oops, something went wrong to the user, so that the user gets some feedback about that the app is not working correctly. For now, we just have console log. Even a window.alert will be better. Do error just because this is for debugging purposes. Cool. So we could do that. We could destructure in here res. Let's just do it like that. Now the question is, let's see, we have a problem in Axios. Import Axios from Axios. Oh, this has to be a quotes. Cool. Then what? We write a function. When do we want to call this function? Michael? Okay, so we're gonna do. So what Michael is suggesting is use effect, which is hooks. Just so that we don't have two moving parts, hooks and Redux, let's just do it with the class component. So any other, what will be the option with a class component? I mean, component did mount. Why component did mount? Joy.
Because you want to call it after the DOM is rendered the first time.
Right, that's correct, because we want to call this function after the DOM has been rendered for the first time, or as soon as the component mounts, right? Then what that is suggesting then is, oh, this has to be a class now, because we need the lifecycle methods, component did mount, and only class have those. As Michael said, you could also do it with use effect, which replaces that lifecycle method. So for now, let's just do convert this to a class. Class films extends React.component. We're gonna need a constructor. Or here's a question. Do we need state? Why not? We're not gonna need a state because we already have the store, and the store is where we're gonna keep the information. Traditional, let's say going back to before Redux, what would we do? Before Redux, what would we do? Peter. Right, like let's do it so that we just have it as a reference. Regularly we'll do, we get a super, and we get this dot state equal. Actually, let's do it like this, and then we take it out and move it into the Redux store. Films. Extends. We will need a render function. Let's leave this one out. Render that returns our JSX. Right? And what is this about? This squiggly line. Joanne? That's correct, because we're inside of a class. We can't have const or declare variables just like that. What we do is we declare this variable as a method in the class, right? And for that, we just need to remove the const. So that the way in which we're going to call this function is this.fetchFilms. Cool. Now we will do, let's say, component did mount. Let's do then on component did mount. What we want to do is fetch all the films. And that's it. I mean, right. So let's first make sure that the films are being fetched as the component mount. So let's go back to our app. Let's go to home films. Right now, if we have everything correctly, this function fired, and if we inspect the network request, maybe we will see it there. So it's empty. Let me clear this out. Let's go to home. Oops, network. Go to home. Then we go to films, and we see the network request popping up here. We could also have left a console log in here after line 20, but we see the network request going out. We see we get a response that is raw here, pretty here in the preview. And this is what we have. We have the information about the film. We had an ID, we had a title, description, people, species, vehicles, etc. Cool. We get our information, traditionally, we will save this information to the state, right? Like with right here, we'll do something like this.set state films. Just res.data, right? And let's see if this then now put the films in our state, in our local state. Let's go here the same. Let's go now to components. And if we inspect our films component, that's all the way at the end, we get in our state some films with objects that represent an individual film, right? Questions up until this point. Network request saving the films to React state. Yes?
Can I see your sheet? No.
This is just because sort of I want to show you the way that we would do it, and then how we're going to take it out of here and use the store instead. Other questions? Well, this panel should feel familiar, where you want to as soon as the user navigates to a page, you want something to happen. You want to display something to the user. In this case, as soon as the user navigates to films, we want to display a list of films, which we could do now. I think we should do that now. Yeah, let's do that now. Let's go in here. Let's bring the films from the state. Call this state. And another React common pattern. How do we display the films? How do we display a list of films? A little bit louder, that's correct. That's correct. Map the films. I really like that word. That's the correct word. Map the films array to a component, to an array of components to display it. So let's see. Let's do it here. Let's not create another component for that. So I'm going to turn this into a div. Remove that, and we're gonna map. Literally, we're gonna loop over this again. This should start feeling pretty familiar by now. You want to make a list of anything. You have some data that is an array most of the time, and you want to display that as a list to the user. You're gonna loop over that data, and for each element in that data, you're gonna display an image, or you're gonna display a p tag. Or something that utilizes that data to display to the user. So in here we're going to do films.map. Films.map. And remember that to map, like all array methods, receives a callback function where the callback receives the element. I'm going to call it film singular. We got our callback there, callback that receives every single element one by one. And for each film, what I want to do is I want to return a link, because thinking a little bit ahead, we're going to make this list of movies. Each one is going to be a link. We're going to display the title of the movie, and each one is going to display a link that's going to take us to a different page later on. So let's do link. Oops, parenthesis here, I like. Link. And this link is going to be to film. I forgot what it looks like. Anyone remembers the title? I think maybe, let's guess film.title. We might get a bunch of undefineds, or we might get the actual title. And let's import link at the top, since that it was not auto-imported. Import link from React router. Let's see. Cool. We guessed right. We have a list of movies. Actually, since this is a list, let's actually be semantically correct and use a UL, because ULs are for lists, and let's use an LI wrapping our link so that semantically correct. Yes. Oh, thank you. That demonstrated you have seen this pattern a few times by now. When we were iterating over an array and creating a component for each element in the array, in this case we're creating an li for each element in the array for each element title, you will get this error, or this warning rather, saying each child in the list should have a unique key prop. So in here, for each item, we need to pass a key prop, and the value of this prop has to be something that uniquely identifies the element. We saw that the films have an ID, or we could also use a title. I don't think they're repeated movies. It has to be anything that uniquely identifies the item. So that way we got rid of that, and we have our list of links. With CSS, we could get rid of the dots and so on. We're not going to do that now. But let's see. So these links don't work, but we get a list of things. Questions up until this point? Okay, what am I missing to make these links work? Take me to a different page. Yobo. A to prop in the link. So what we're going to do is to/film.id, but since this is going to be, we need this film ID to be interpreted to actually be accessed. Let's do backticks here, and $sign curly brackets. Oh, and then that has to be wrapped in curly brackets, because a template literal, which is these things that we write with backticks, that's a JavaScript expression. All right, so we have this. Now we have all the links are blue now. Before they were this purple. Now if we go to paying attention to the URL, we go to Castle in the Sky, we go to film/.id, Grave of the Fireflies, My Neighbor Totoro, the ID is changing. We don't have a component to handle that yet. That's what we're going to do next. But any questions? A list. This is no different from the list of YouTube videos that you did for the YouTube client, or list of to-dos. Again, very common pattern. We're just making a list of links. Okay, so this is cool, but let's say, for instance, now, okay, so if we go to home and we go to films, we get the list. And this list this list is being, every time I go to films, is making another network request to get the films, right? That's not necessarily bad, but another advantage of Redux is if we save this this list of films in the store, which is global, right? Then we will be able to just make this network request only once, right? And because we're gonna save the films in the store. The store is like at the top level, independent. We're gonna be able to save a little bit of bandwidth there, where that network request doesn't happen every time. It's just being read from the store. Okay. Questions, comments, thoughts?
Can you see the component in the mount file?
Yes. Component in mount, whose job is to fetch all the films, to call the function that fetches all the films.
Oh, okay.
Cool. So now let's actually think about, so we want to keep these films not in state. In fact, I'm going to get rid of that. Let's maybe comment it out. Then our app completely breaks because there is no longer any films in the state and so on. How can we then save these films to the store? It's going to be in the same way that we save the counter to the store.
So like the first thing that you have when you're exporting the film out of
Yes, we're going to need to connect the component. Owen,
Yeah, I was going to say reducer.
say that again.
Reducer?
We're going to need to create a reducer. Why do we need a reducer? I mean, to modify the state, right? So let's say the question could be, well, we already have a reducer. We have counter reducer. Why don't we just use that? Because that's for the counter. That's correct, right? And I said this yesterday, where we want one reducer to manage one part of the state, right? Yes.
Would there ever be any necessary use
For two parts of the state. I haven't run into any case where I would want to do that. Yeah, so I can't fully answer that. Other questions or comments? Yes, yourself. That's correct. What else do we need? So, sort of the pieces that we were talking about. We're gonna need actions. What would those actions look like? There's actually gonna be just one for now. Cameron?
Yes, and like moving from number 2 to 2, like the path.
No, the actions will not have anything to do with the URL yet. Right. Right. The action could be something like add films. Thinking of add, yes, this is a fine name. Add films or receive films, save films. Yes.
This stuff is like kind of correspond with like depending on what kind of request it's making.
Give me some.
Like for like social media, if we want to like patch or delete stuff, would that be like reflected in action, or would you have to make something?
Yeah, yeah, you could have something like update update films or update. Yeah, so I guess the short answer is yes. You could. I'm glad that you see some parallel there. There is definitely that. This is the only one action. The only one action that we're gonna need at the time. Anything else? Let's say that. Yeah.
We're just talking about right now, not review films.
Yeah, not the review yet. I think this is it. I don't remember. We need. Well, I guess from here we're gonna need. That's kind of connected to the reducer. We're gonna need an initial state, right? That's gonna be started an empty array. Since we're going to have now two reducers that manage two different parts of state. One manages the counter, another one is going to manage the film. I said that when we have more than one reducer, we're going to need to use a function called combine reducers. Combine reducers. And this function, once we see it, in this function we're going to say this reducer manages this part of the state, and this other reducer manages this other part of the state. We're going to get to that. Yeah, I think this is it. So let's then start to think about, we could connect the component. Let's do that first. Connect the component. So in films, here we can say connect films, like that. Then we get this error, connect is not defined. Let's import that at the top. Connect from React Redux. Since we already have the provider at the top, we don't have to worry more anything. We don't have to worry about the provider anymore because we already are using it at the top of our component tree. And then we have cannot read property films. That's still sort of that still is because we removed it from the state. Now where are the films going to come from? So let's do that next. So we did this. And then we're going to need to come back to this. You remember that in here, when I talked about connect, what are the two functions that we need to pass in here? Map state to props, map dispatch to props. Here, let's do this. I'm going to define them. Const map state to props state. This function always receives the state. And return. Here, let's do this. The same thing we did yesterday. Let's return the state. And let's do const. We're going to see that we not always are going to return just the state from here. But let's look at that. Map dispatch to props. And this guy receives the dispatch function. And what do we remember about this function? It returns what? It doesn't return a function. It returns an object with what inside? Not actions. Let's look at the counter. Counter JSX. Let's go in here. Map dispatch to props. What is this function returning? Not action types. Peter? So It's returning an object with functions, right? The increment and the decrement function. Now, what are those functions doing? What is the increment function doing? Or what is it going to do once we call it? This is the keyword. It's going to literally dispatch an action to the store. So that's the map dispatch to props. The map dispatch to props, we set up some functions that are going to get passed to the component as props, where those functions are the actual ones that are going to dispatch the actions to the store. So same thing we're going to do here. For now, actually, let's leave it empty for now. We're going to get back to this. Let's just pass this to here. Map state to props. Always map state to props goes first. Always map dispatch to props go next. If you interchange them, they're not going to work. We still got that error. Let's see if our application, we can get a glimpse of our application right before it breaks. Let's do components. Oh no, compiler. Let's refresh the page. We don't get any glimpse. It just breaks. Let's console log here. Console log this.props. What I want to show you is that this component is connected to the store now and has access to it through the props. Oh, thank you. And let's go to the console now. Let's refresh. Scroll up. Counter is running. Actually, we don't see it. We'll still need a reducer for it to work. Oh, actually, I think, you know what? It's because of this line is the one that's breaking. And I'm console logging right after that. So, which means I'm never going to console log. I think we should see something. Oh, I don't think we see it. Oh, okay. There's something here. Props. Let's look at this. It's breaking because those films, we no longer have state. So films, yes. Films is undefined. Actually saying, well, since you don't have state, you don't have films. But in here, we have this console log. We actually see two props. Let's look at this. And here we see this, our counter. This is the state that we have, right? This is the information that we have in the store. And now this counter is being received in the films, thanks to our map state to props, right? So that's what I wanted to show you, that this component, even though it's breaking at the moment, has access to the state, right? By showing here that its props is starting with counter at 100. Cool, so that's the first part. Now we just need to get another key in our store to keep the films, right? But before that, any questions regarding what we have done so far? Yes? Oh, this part, I comment this out. So we're no longer going to have state. The films are going to be saved in the store. We're going to read them from there. We're going to save them there. Now then, we need this part. We have our, say, we haven't fully completed this step, connecting the component, just because we haven't set up the dispatch as well. We're going to do this next, create a reducer. So all reducers are similar. They are, as we said there, they're all functions. They should be pure functions. They receive the state and an action. They make a copy of the state, look at the action, modify the state based on the action, and it returns the modified copy. So if we go then to create a reducer, let's do this. So in here, we created this reducers folder. Now I'm going to create a new file in there. I'm going to call it films reducer.js. And just so that we have it as a reference, I'm going to put in here the counter reducer to the side. And what do we need then? So we're going to need some action types. We're going to need initial state. We're going to need to define a function reducer that receives the state and the action. So actually, let's do this first. Let's add the action type. We go to the action type. Let's do export const add, which I'm going to call this receive films. Because we're sort of receiving these films from the network request. Receive film, so I added that as an action type. And then here we're going to do import receive films. Oh, kind of running out of time. From action, actually one level up, action types. Const initial state. We can do films. We said that's going to be an empty array. Const films reducer. We say state equal initial state. We say action. Now try to think about the stuff that's going to go inside. Don't forget to export. So what would we write inside? So what do we put inside of a reducer? Douglas.
Copy of the state.
Copy of the state. Anything else? Maybe Peter? A switch case. Copy state. Why do we want to switch? Oh, this is cool. Why do we want a switch statement? Cameron?
Depending on what we're doing with the state of the films, we can decide how to do another action with that.
Right, we want a switch statement to decide to look at the action, and depending on what the action wants to do, act accordingly, right? I mean,
If anything, in this case, we have only one condition, so we get it.
okay, that's a good observation. What Amin is suggesting is, in this case, we just have one action, so we could use that an if statement, and that the answer is yes, we could just have an if statement. But the idea is that we need that logic that will decide how the state is modified, right? This is when I say the reducer modifies the state based on what the action is asking or what the action is dictating, right? This is the logic where we get to decide. We could do it with an if statement. We're actually going to have another action, which is going to be the one for adding reviews. So I'm going to start with a switch, even though it's just for one. So let's do this. Cool. So first of all, let's make a copy of the state. This time I'm going to call it new state. Copy of state is also a fine name. I think new state conveys a little bit more of what we're doing. Made a copy of it. Then in the switch, sort of decide how the state is to be modified. Depending on the action type. Oh, this thing, I have this extension that helps me with spelling mistakes. You should install it as well. It has saved me a lot. I think it's, let's see, I think it's just called Spellcheck. Yeah, code spell checker. Can help you with typos as well, because if you name something counter and you mistyped anything, is gonna show you that script line. The code speller. I think you can do right click, or what I do is, let's see, films. I think the shortcut is Command period, and it shows you options to replace it. Just look at the documentation. Cool, so we were on the reducer. We made a copy of the state, decide how the state is to be modified depending on the action type. So we're going to do switch statement. The key that we want to look at is action.type. The value is, for the case, is receive films. What we want to do, what do we want to do? Oh yes, we're gonna need to send the payload. That's correct. So the problem that Hupel is seeing here is, how do we send? Before with the counter, we just sent the type, right? Increment or decrement. That was our action, just with type. Now we're gonna see the value of why we can add more keys to the action, like a payload. And that payload is going to contain the films, actually. So even though we haven't created our actions yet, let's assume that action is going to have a type property as well as a payload property. The payload property will contain the films. So let's do something like this. So, okay, let's imagine we have the films in the action.payload. What do we do with them? Yeah. We just need to, so in action.payload, we have the films, and we just need to save them to the state. I mean, equals action.payload. That's correct. Here we're just setting the films property of the new state to be our films. Again, this is going to have our films. We could do it like this, or if we were to use, let's say the payload needed a few other properties, we could also do like payload.films. Like this sort of depends on what you want. But right now the payload is just going to contain the film, so let's just simplify that and say this. Again, here we're not modifying the original state, we're modifying the copy, the new state. Remember, to never push or equal anything with the actual state, always with the copy. Break, default break, return, new state. We got our reducer. Let's see, wait, this return has to be outside of the switch. We got our reducer. This reducer, again, is going to handle the films chunk of our state. Yes, William?
And the default return the new state is break, return an empty.
Wait, say that again?
You have break the default, you just return a new state.
Like here? Yeah, so we saw yesterday that we could do return, we could do this. Here and here. We can return a new state, but then the break is then useless because return already breaks. So it's up to you, like the way that you want to implement it. In here, I think this is the one that we have less repetition, where we just return one. This breaks out of the switch, returns the modified, the new state. Cool. So then from here, we will need to pass this reducer to the create store function, right? If we look at our store, we have this. We have remember that this is the file store.js inside of our store. Inside of our store folder, store.js. Now here, we can see how we're using the counter reducer here. The way that we're doing it is we import the counter reducer and then we pass the counter reducer to the create store function. This window is just for the extension. And you could think, oh, we just need to pass the other thing here, but that's actually not correct. We're not going to import and just pass the other reducer there. As I said, we need to combine the reducers. We need to combine the reducers before we pass them to the store. Now, a common pattern is you import your reducers into a file called root reducer. You combine them there, and then you just return the result, which is the combined reducers, or also known as the root reducer. So the way in which we're going to do that is, in reducers, I'm just going to create a new file called root reducer.js. And this is because we need to do this because at the top level, the store can only have one reducer. So we just combine them and then pass that one combine to the store. So let me put the store here on the right, on the left. So what we're going to do here is import our two reducers. Import counter reducer. So let me just copy it from here. Import count reducer from, oh, actually this is a different place now. Since we are already in the reducers folder, this will be just dot current folder slash counter reducer. Same thing for the films reducer, films from films reducer. So this is sort of this is something new, the root reducer, where we are going to combine them, and we also need to import, I guess maybe even at the top, import from React, actually not React, from Redux, I think, a function called combine reducers. Combine reducers. And then let's create a variable called const root reducer. Yeah. Actually, just root reducer. And then root reducer has to be the combined version of our reducers. The way in which you combine them is by calling the properly named function combine reducers, and we just need to pass our reducers to it. It does all the magic for us. Counter reducer films. Oh, I forgot to call this films reducer. This is more a convention than a hard rule, ending your variable names with reducers if they are reducers. So it looks like this, and we just do export the root reducer. Oh, actually, let me go to the documentation. I think I'm forgetting something about the combine reducers, so let's look at the documentation. Combine reducers Redux. Combine reducers Redux. Combine reducers. As your app grows more complex, you'll want to split your reducing function into separate functions, each managing independent parts of state. This is what we talked about. One reducer function for one part of state. The combine reducers helper function turns an object whose values are different reducing functions into a single reducing function you can pass to create store. Okay. The resulting reducer calls every child reducer and gathers the results into a single state object. The state produced by combined reducers, namespaces, and we have an example here. Question I think I saw in the back?
No, just a situation.
Okay. Let's look at this example. And let's look at the, oh, this is cool like this, a little bit better. So we see here that combined reducers have to be called with an object, first of all, as we see by the curly brackets. This object is where we're going to say this reducer manages this part of the state. In here we have like the potato part of the state of whatever this application is going to be managed by the potato reducer. And the tomato part of the state is going to be managed by the tomato reducer, and so on. So that's exactly what we need to do in here. So I'm wrong in passing these two functions here. We're going to pass in an object. Combine reducers receives an object. The keys are going to be the part of the state that the reducer function is going to manage. So I'm going to say counter is going to be managed by the counter reducer. And let's see, part of state reducer. in charge. This is the part. Sort of as a comment for. Say that again. Sorry, I think I'm not hearing correctly. Common core. I don't remember saying that, but maybe I did. Reducer. So the keys are the parts of the state, and the values are the reducers that are going to manage that part of the state. That's the sort of the main point that you should remember from combined reducers. And then we're going to do films, and we're going to have films reducer. Okay, so let's then export default root reducer. Sometimes you will see like this, like literally called root reducer. Something else you might see is in the reducers folder an index.js file, and then there is where it's being combined, which is going to be something like this. Some other people combine it in the store, which they're all valid options. Combining like in the store file and then just using it here. Yes.
Can you explain the window Redux DevTools?
I did explain that yesterday. This is so that the extension that we installed, the Redux developer tools, can hook into our stage and let us read it and see it. So this line we got from the React developer tool documentation, and they instructed us to use it in this fashion. If we could, our application will do fine without it. It's just that we want to inspect the store with the React developer tools, the Redux developer tools. I mean, cool. So I said the store can only take in one reducer when it's being created. We talked about let's combine those and just pass the combined reducer. And what we're going to do is stop importing the counter reducer here. I'm going to import the root reducer now from reducers / root reducer. And instead of passing the counter reducer here, we're going to pass in the root reducer. Because the root reducer is the combined version, it contains the counter reducer in it, we could think of. Let's save that. Questions? Let's see if this worked. If this worked correctly, if we set up this correctly, now we should see that in our store we have the counter as well as the films, even though they start empty for now. Let's look at the application. Let's close this documentation. Refresh here, seems to be breaking. Well, it's breaking for the same reason, which is we used to have state, we no longer have that. But if we go back to our films component, this is the line that's breaking again because we don't longer have state. We're trying to access a property of something that doesn't exist. But right before that, we're console logging the props. And because map state to props literally map the state from our store to props that are passed to our component, we should be able to see something when we console log the props. And here we are console logging those props. I think maybe this is too small for people in the back. Let's do that, expand this, and now we see our component receiving two things, the counter and the films. we see that the counter, this is a little bit redundant. We have like counter that counter, and we have films. What we could do few things here. One, we know that the counter is never going to need anything else, so we could just initialize the counter state to actually the number itself rather than an object with a counter property. The films, though, we're going to have the films array as well as the reviews of those films. I'm not sure if we're actually going to get to see the reviews due to time. But let's bring this point home, which is, so let's inspect the Redux tools here. Redux. Right, so this is the chart option. Generally, we're in the inspector. We see state. I like to see it in raw. And we have this. This is what our state looks like. Oh, this is the option that I was looking for yesterday. The dispatch, so that we could try sending an action. I couldn't find it yesterday. But this is our state. Or this is the states that are being kept in the store. We have a counter. We have a films. And these objects are the initial states that we defined. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this film state, because again, the film state is going to have films and it's going to have films review. So we're going to add another key later on here, something like that. Films reviews. The counter, though, we could just, since we're not going to keep anything else in the counter than just the counter, we could instead just do this. This is just a demonstration. These changes are not going to take effect. We could initialize the counter straight rather than in an object. But before we get there, questions about the root reducer, the combination. Yes?
When I did that, my counter didn't stop working.
That's correct. Your counter stopped working. That is because what I was talking about here. This is our current state. It looks like this. So the counter broke because before we were just doing this.props.counter, right? Now we're gonna need to say this.props.counter.counter. But that's the suggestion. That's the solution I'm suggesting. Let's not keep the counter as an object. Let's just keep the number. What we could do for that, sort of real quick here, is we go to the counter reducer and we say the initial state is going to be just the number, no need for the object. But again, this is because we see that the counter state is not going to grow. There's nothing else we want to keep that's related to the counter. If we do that, from the initial state we just set 100. In fact, we could just do it here instead of doing an initial state variable. If we go to the developer tools, we look at the state again, we see it raw. Oh, we get counter 0. Yeah, so then that will force us to do this. Yeah, I guess we're gonna need to go with that counter, just because I don't want to change everything else. Because in here, in the making the copy of the state, that will be an example where, since it's just the state is a primitive, is a string, is a number, a boolean, then we wouldn't need to make a copy in this sense. We can just say a new variable with the all value. Okay, so questions, comments about what we have so far, how the state is being passed onto the component. How do we fix then this error? It's breaking because the films, we're trying to read the films from the state, but we no longer have them there. Read it from the props. We are mapping the state to the props of the component. Again, the name map state to props. So in our films component, we can just say film instead is not going to come from state. Is going to come from. Wait, actually, let's go back here. So this is what the state looks like. What I want to change is instead of films.films, I'm going to call this film state. This key. Where do we change this key? Like in the reducer, I said this part of state is being managed by this reducer. This part of state is being managed by this reducer. So here we can say films state. That change then reflects in the developer tools as we go to state. And then we see raw. This is the object. And again, we see that the root reducer and the combined reducers combine our state as well, right? We see that there's this object. We can think of the outer object as our store, and any inner keys individual states, right? So we get this composed state thanks to the combined reducers. When we didn't have combined reducers, we just had one that was holding the counter. So we now have film state. If we go to the console where we're console logging the props of our component, we see that these are the props that are being passed to our component. History, location, and match are props that are being passed by the React router to our component. And counter and film state are props that are being passed by the map state to props function. Now, and from here, then we need, as Amin suggested, we just need to access the films from this prop, which is going to be this.props.filmState.films. So if we go back to our films, we're going to say this.props.film state. This.props.film state instead of our local state. Let's see if that works. Okay, now our component is not. Oh, it broke there. Oh, this is, I guess, this is what Sergio warned us about, which is films works, doesn't break. There's not showing anything because we haven't added any films to the state. But now counter breaks, saying objects are not valid as React child. Found object with key is counter. If you meant to render a collection of children, use an array instead. Again, here, for instance, these are the props that are being passed to the counter component. And we see this. We see the same props that we saw in the films component. We see the counter and the film state. So this is where Sergio was suggesting, well, we need to update that to counter that counter. Because we have the counter. You know what? Let's call this the root reducer also counter state, so that it's a little bit more clear. And then in our counter component, we are just going to say props counter state that counter. Yes, we can do that. I decided against it just for time. Now we have our counter working again. Questions, comments? Yes. I changed this so that the part of the state is called counter state. That part of our state is going to be managed by the counter reducer. And then in my counter component, I had to update where I was reading the number from by saying props counter state that counter. Yes.
In the films, JS, is it being destructured twice? We use the map, or is it still this?
In the films.js,
Yeah, because
where like in here.
you're not doing anything. Oh, dispatch. You put something in dispatch.
Not yet. That's next.
So maybe this stuff here. I thought it was film state that.
You're expecting to see scroll all the way down. That's all. Oh, shit, that's fine. Right, okay, so no, this is cross, this is films.
Yeah.
Because you can't go along these ups, down, down. So you are getting films. Maybe console is better than ups. That's why questions, comments?
Yeah, well, didn't it?
Say that again?
Are you getting films in the right?
No, it's empty. Still empty. We haven't saved the film
The
yet.
actual something in there.
Okay, so let's talk about, for instance, when we're in the counter. Let me go from films. There it is. We go to counter. Oh, damn it. Go to home. Just refresh on counter. I want to see the props that are being passed to the counter. Oh, right, I don't have a console log. I guess we can look at them here. If we go to components and we go to the counter, we can see these props. These props are props being passed to our counter component, you see? Now, like history, location, match, those are coming from the React router, but we see the counter state with the counter, and we also see the decrement. We also see the film state, right? But the counter, does the counter need to care about films? It doesn't need to care about films, right? Then here's where the other sort of part to map state to props comes in. On map state to props, what we can do is, pass to the component only the information that it needs instead of passing the whole state. Right now, if we go to our map state to props in the counter, map state to props here, we see that we're just returning the entire state. This is why the counter not only gets the counter state, but it also gets the film state. So what we can do here is then simplify this a little bit, where we do instead just return an object with a key called maybe counter state that is equal to state that counter state. Let's leave the films out. They're not needed in the counter. Instead of just returning the entire state from map state to props, we just return an object with the part that it actually that the component is actually interested in. This has the advantage of, so if we modify, now this is a little bit hard to see, but if we modify the films and the counter state is, we modify the film state and the counter is still receiving the film state, when we modify the film state, the counter component will re-render because it saw a change in the state. So a change in the state, even though that state doesn't really pertains to the counter component, doesn't affect it. It shouldn't affect it, right? And here we just pass the information that we actually want, so that when that information changes, the component re-renders. There's no need to pass extra information. Like the counter doesn't need to care about films. So if we do that, then everything should be working as expected still. And if we go to the counter, we see that now we just have the counter state. We no longer have the films. Right? Keep your component being passed only the props that they actually need. Don't pass stuff that the component shouldn't care about. Now going back to the films, we initialize the state, we define the reducer, create the reducer, we have an action, we call it receive films, we combine the reducers. The next thing that we need to do is actually dispatch an action. Then that's where our map dispatch to props comes in. Oh, also, even before we go there, the films, if we look at it now, we go to films, we look at the props of films. Same story. Films is receiving the film state and the counter state. The films doesn't care about the counter state, unless we wanted to show the counter state for some reason, but in this case we don't. So let's sort of narrow it down to only pass the film state. So in here, same story. Let's return an object that only has the film state. Film state equal state dot film state. So that now our films component only gets the film state, doesn't get the counter. As we see that again in the developer tools, counter state is gone. And then for the map dispatch to props, what did we say? What did we say is the thing that the map dispatch to props is going to return and what it contains inside? An object with close. An object with functions, I heard it. And what do those functions do? Dispatch actions. So in here we're gonna call it, generally it's called like, we call the functions the same as the action, but it's just camel case. So let's call it receive films. That's the name of the function. The value is, or the name of the key and the value is this function. This function, what it's going to do is it's going to return, and actually it doesn't need to return, just call dispatch, and let's send our action. Type, we said receive films. Here, once I hit enter, even though I haven't imported it, it's going to import it for me. Receive films. And we saw that here. Oh, here we're actually gonna see a good little challenge right before we leave. So we imported receive films here, and we're dispatching that action that has the type, right? This was enough for the increment, right? But now we need to actually pass the films to the reducer for the reducer to actually save them to the state. That's where the payload key comes in. Here, we're going to need another key, payload. And somehow here, we need to put the films. The films that arrive from the network request. How do we get the films that arrived from the network request into this action? Michael? Pass it in as an argument. So what we're going to do is once we call this function, we're going to call it receive films, and we pass in films. So in here, we're going to get films. Or you could call it data, anything, receive films. Then, let's just verify in here, as I go to films, I want to see the props. Now films is receiving the film state history match, as well as then this new prop called receive films. This is the function that we are passing to our component thanks to the map dispatch to props. Right? Receive films. Now, the last thing we need to do is just call this function, call the function receive films, which is going to dispatch an action to the store, carrying the films, and save them to our state. How do we do that? In here, you remember this part, set state. That's gone, and instead we say this.props that receive films, this function that we wrote here, the receive film functions, now we need to call it. Receive films res.data. We said that's the part, res.data is the one that contains the array of films. We save that, and if we have everything plugged in correctly, our app should be back to a working state.
Where do we import dispatch from?
Dispatch, if we go at the top of films, dispatch is a function that is received by map dispatch to props.
Okay.
Dispatch is passed to map dispatch to props because we pass that to connect. So connect is the one that's actually passing the dispatch. Mm-hmm. And we're gonna leave that for today. How many of you ended up with a working app? Okay. If you want, I can take a look at maybe some of the issues you had. Tomorrow we can attempt to do the reviews and then do the lab. Yes, John? Yeah, I can. This one?